Hello there. So today I'd like to talk to you about the great philosopher Plato. He was born in 427 BC in ancient Greece, in Athens, and he died in 347. And he's one of the giants in the history of Western philosophy. The word Plato is actually a nickname. His real name was Aristocles. Plato is a nickname that means broad-shouldered one. And his philosophy has been perhaps one, if not the most, certainly one of the most important and influential philosophies in the history of the Western world. Plato founded the first, I'd like to just say a few things about Plato's life, and I won't go on about that because today I wanted to talk to you about Plato's notion of human nature, which is a very big topic, and I'm going to try to just delineate some of the most salient dimensions of his understanding of human nature. But you should know at the beginning, when you study philosophy, these great philosophers, the ones that have risen up to become the seminal thinkers of our tradition, each one is like a university. So one could write, there have been, in fact, many books written just on Plato's notion of human nature. And not only that, but every other topic that one can imagine. So philosophy has to do with raising ultimate questions and providing answers to these ultimate questions. And it's an ongoing dialogue. And as I was saying, Plato is one of the great voices in this great dialogue called philosophy, this great conversation about ultimate issues. And one ultimate issue is the nature of humanity. What does it mean to be human? That discipline has come to be known as philosophical anthropology, from the word anthropoi, which means human in Greek, and ology, which comes from the word legein, and it has many meanings, but one of the meanings is the study of something. So the study of humanity, that's anthropology, but philosophical anthropology is the philosophical approach to humanity. Well, what makes philosophy different from anthropology and from every other discipline is that it raises ultimate questions, first principles, that is, the principles upon which all the other disciplines are based. So the big question about philosophical anthropology is, what is human nature? And so some courses and some universities, rather than call it philosophical anthropology, they call it the philosophy of human nature. And there are as many theories of human nature as there are philosophers. And we, put these philosophers into different schools of thought. So Plato founded this one school of thought called idealism. And he's not the only idealist, but he's the founder of this tradition, this school of thought called idealism. A school of thought is the basic orientation of a thinker towards reality, towards these ultimate questions. And so he's the founder of this tradition called idealism. Later on, there will be other idealists, like, for example, in Germany during the modern period, there were the great German idealists, Immanuel Kant, Fichte, Schelling, and Hegel, for example, where speculation reaches this absolute peak in crystallization. So there are other idealists, but Plato lays the foundation. And the reason he's called an idealist is because he believes that the idea is the ultimate reality, that the ideal is the real. Now that sounds kind of silly at the beginning if you just say it, but once you begin to understand what he means by that, it starts making more and more sense. Plato was very much influenced by a man who was about 40 years older than him. His name was Socrates, or in English, Socrates. And Socrates was executed in 399 BC by an extreme right-wing government, an oligarchy that took over the Athenian government, and they trumped up these charges against Socrates, and it stuck. He defended himself in court, and Plato wrote a great dialogue on that called the Apology, which is a defense of that Socrates' defense in court. But he was found guilty, and he had to drink hemlock after a long stay in prison, and he was executed. Well, Plato was appalled by that because Socrates was his great teacher. And after Socrates died, Plato decided rather than to go into politics, which he was destined to do, being an aristocrat, he instead became a philosopher. But politics was always at the forefront of his thinking. But he realized that if he had become a politician, he would not be able to change things on a deep enough level. So he wanted to change the very foundation of the age that he lived in. He wanted radical political restoration. That is, a complete transformation in the political structure of the state. And so politics was always at the forefront of his thinking. In fact, 3 times Plato went to a place called Syracuse, which is in Italy. And it still has the same name today, Saracusa, which is now part of Italy, but in ancient times it was part of Magna Graecia, part of Greece. And Plato went there 3 times in real life and tried to put his great republic, his ideal city-state, his ideal polis into practice. And 3 times it failed. And it failed, but what it tells us is that politics was always at the forefront of his thinking. But Plato's thought moves beyond politics. I'm only mentioning it now because I want to give my talk on human nature a political slant, because that was Plato's main objective. But there are other great topics in Plato's philosophy besides political philosophy. Also, the reading that I gave you to read, namely Book 6 and Book 7 of Plato's Republic, are chapters in one of his largest books, which is 10, it's one book, but it's 10 parts. In classical, the classical approach to things sometimes divides chapters into what they call books, but it's just one book. Each chapter is called a book. So Book 6 and Book 7 is what I'd like you to read of Plato's Republic. But I just want to say just a few more things before I get into to shed light on those 2 books for you and bring out the elements of human nature that are contained in those 2 books. Whenever you approach philosophy, you're given a great challenge to interpret. Okay, so the interpretation of philosophy, that's called philology. Philology is the study of the great classics. And it can be in literature, it can be in history, but in philosophy, there are classics. There are great works that are written by some of the greatest thinkers, and they rise up, they become like luminaries. We call them seminal thinkers, like what Beethoven is to music or something, or Michelangelo is to sculpture and painting. So whenever you're approaching a classic book like this, like Plato's Republic or any other, it poses certain challenges to the reader that are much more difficult than just reading something else. And so every author poses different kinds of challenges. Well, in Plato's case, we're given dialogues to read. And Plato is the only one. There are others who try it, but Plato was so great at it, it's sort of like, after somebody does a song that's so great, no one tries to imitate the same song, or it's just even less. But Plato's dialogues were so great that hardly anyone even tried to write dialogues after that, because they would be a paltry thing. But people have tried, and there have been dialogues, but not many. So we have about 37 dialogues that Plato wrote, and scholars put them into the early dialogues, the middle dialogues, and the late dialogues. And they don't know exactly what dates they were written, but the style changes so dramatically, you can see the shift. So I started talking to you about the challenges that philosophy offers the reader. And you have to think about the kind of writing that you're reading. So the first thing to note about reading Plato is that he wrote dialogues. And so the dialogue is a form of expression where people are talking to each other. It's sort of like a play. But the action, it's not like, it's like a play because it's people talking to each other and things happen. And there's a dramatic context and even a little plot. But it's not like a play. The action is not as important as what's being said. So they're called philosophical dialogues. And the main speaker in all of Plato's dialogues is Socrates. Now, like I said, there was a historical Socrates who was Plato's greatest teacher and influence, but he was executed before Plato began to write anything. And so after Plato founded the first university, which is an important thing to know for your education, the very idea of the university was established by Plato, and it was called the academy. That's where we get our word academy, like police academy, the academy of this or that. And because a man by the name of Academus gave Plato this land, and he made this university. And Plato gave lectures there on his philosophy to his students. And he wrote these lectures down, but we've lost them all through time. And, you know, it's been over 2.5 millennia. So all those lectures are lost. But he wrote another series of writings, these dialogues, and they were for the public. And they raised these ultimate questions, and it's Socrates is always the main character. And Socrates, so Plato is sort of blending history. You know, there was a real Socrates who did philosophize in the streets of Athens, and you get to know him as you read these dialogues, and you get to know these people that were in the inner circle and of Socrates. But all the most ultimate questions are raised. What does it mean to be human? What is knowledge? What is truth? What is the beautiful? What is education? Many other, what is the origin and nature of the cosmos? What is the ideal city-state? The ideal structure of the state such that the people can achieve well-being? All these ultimate questions are raised. In fact, one great philosopher, Whitehead was his name, he said, all philosophy is a footnote to Plato, which may be a bit of an exaggeration, but his point was all the main questions are raised there. They're not given definitive answers, but they're raised and a lot of ignorance is shed. Many of the interpretations that have been given to these the answers given to these ultimate questions were already raised by Plato and then deconstructed and rejected by Socrates. And so what Plato is doing is writing these dialogues, raising these ultimate questions, having the reader read them, shedding the ignorance that the dialogues allow us to shed. In other words, getting rid of all the dogmatic answers that are illegitimate. And then he leaves the reader up to himself or herself to come up with an answer to the question that doesn't fall prey to the inadequate ideas that have been given to these answers. And there are answers given too. It's just there are many open-ended things too, because one of the great things that Plato taught his students at the academy was the importance of dialectic, which is philosophical conversation, raising an ultimate question, and trying to come up with an adequate answer, with an adequate idea that captures the definition of that thing, whatever you're questioning. So back to the problems of interpretation. With Plato, it's not only the depth of the material that we need to deal with. Whenever things are deep, they're difficult. That's just how things are. If they were not difficult, they wouldn't be deep. So, so there's a depth to it. But the other problem, it's not really a problem, it's just the other thing you need to know about is that it's a dialogue form. So you can't take anybody, if anyone says anything in the dialogue, you always have to return it to the context in which it's said. That's very important, especially in a dialogue. Like if somebody were to walk into the room right now, they wouldn't know what I'm talking about because they don't have the context. So have you ever had a conversation with someone and then maybe your friend enters the conversation later on, and then if you want to be polite, you try to fill them in. Well, we're just talking about, whatever, Dr. Vincenzo's first lecture on Plato's idea of human nature, and and this is what I'm watching. I'm watching his video or something. You're trying to fill this person in. Why are you doing that? Because you want to give them the context so that they understand what's going on. Well, it's the same thing when you're reading a dialogue. You have to place whatever somebody is saying in the context. So you can't take some character who says something and say that's what Plato said. Now, obviously, Plato wrote the dialogue, so he wrote, but you can't take one character and say that's what Plato meant, okay? So then how do you get to Plato's philosophy? Well, when you read these dialogues, well, that poses some interpretive challenges. It takes a while. This doesn't come overnight. What I want to do for you right now is just give you a glimpse into Plato's world, into this world, and hopefully highlight in that glimpse some of the important dimensions of his idea of human nature. But the big picture is this, that all the great thinkers, or anybody who's educated well, has nourished themselves on the dialogues of Plato. However much you put into it, that's what you get out of it. So when you read the dialogues, what happens is you take what you do understand and you relate it to other things that you've read, other dialogues, and one dialogue begins to shed light on another dialogue. And then you can use these dialogues to shed light on each other. And as time goes by, you begin to see what Plato's expressing through these dialogues. Now, what I'm going to do for you, since I've spent so many years, I've been 7 times to Greece, 7 conferences. In 7 summers I spent in Greece, and published widely in Greek philosophy. I've had some people are brushing shoulders with some of the best scholars in Greek philosophy. So I have been doing this for a long time. And I've read all of Plato's dialogues. Some I know better than others, some of the dialogues. So what I'm going to do for you is just take 2 chapters, and I'm going to bring out the highlights of those 2 chapters. And I'm going to do something that one can do only after having studied all the dialogues. I'm going to read into the dialogues things. Now, usually when you're interpreting something, you don't want to read your own ideas into the text. You want to get out of the way completely, and you want to allow the author to speak. And you want to return everything back to context, because what you're trying to find, it's like listening to somebody. If you're doing all the talking, you're not going to understand anything they're saying either. Or even if you're thinking about what you want to say while they're talking, you're not going to be able to understand what they're saying. So the main thing to do when you're reading Plato or any philosopher is simply listen, be quiet and listen and try to understand, which is challenging enough. But after having studied Plato for a while, and you can start reading things into the text. Now, what you're reading into the text are not your own opinions. See, that's the key. What I'm going to do for you, I'm going to read things into the text, but what I read into the text is going to be from some other place in Plato's philosophy. Okay? And so I'm not really reading my own ideas into the text. I'm taking other things that Plato said that are related to the text, and I'm making it fuller for you. Because if I don't do that, then we're not going to have very much on human nature in the readings. Okay, so I don't mean to confuse you. I'm just trying to tell you that when you're reading Plato's dialogues, you have to try to find out what Plato's expressing in the dialogues. And you can't reduce his teaching to any particular person, not even Socrates, who's closest to Plato. Although it is much closer to Plato than any of his interlocutors, the people with whom he's speaking. But at the same time, you can't reduce Plato's philosophy to what Socrates says in the dialogues. So it's a tricky thing. You read the dialogues, and as time goes by, you begin to get a sense of what Plato's expressing in the dialogue. Okay, well, so let me talk about the Republic as a whole. And then I'm going to focus on those two books, book 6 and book 7, and I'm going to try to pull out for you the main aspects of human nature from those two books. So what's the Republic all about? And why is it called the Republic? Well, let me address the second question first. Why is it called the Republic? Well, the original title was not Republic. It was called Politia in Greek. It's the root of the word politics, police, political. It comes from polis, P-O-L-I-S, which means city-state. And in ancient Greece, the Greek world was made up of a series of city-states. Each state had its own constitution. Each state was a city. But it all made up the Greek world, but it wasn't a nation state yet. The whole notion of a nation state comes much later in modern times. So what Plato is raising here is, and remember, I told you that politics was at the forefront of his thinking. What is the ideal polis? Now that's the big question of the Republic. And so what he does after book 1, which is an introductory book, in book 1, he raises that question. And the other big question raised in book 1 is, what is justice? Because the ideal state is going to be one based on justice. And then books 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, all the way to 7 are his development in language of the ideal polis, the ideal city-state. What would be ideal? Well, for Plato, the ideal would be the well-being of the citizens. Okay? The well-being of the citizens, which is the very goal of politics for Plato. And then book 8, 9, and 10, he shows the degeneration. What will be the forces that will undermine this republic and bring it to its demise? So it became one of the great books of all time. It's the first major treatise on Republican political theory, Republican with a little r. I use a capital R for the Republican Party, which changes depending on what people appropriate that name. Like the Republican Party today was certainly not the Republican Party of the time of Abraham Lincoln and so on. It depends on who is it that makes up the party. That's Republican with a capital R. Then there's Republican political theory, which starts with Plato. And there are great thinkers. The next most important thinker is Aristotle. And then there's a whole history of Republican political theory. So the Republic of Plato is the first major philosophical expression of the principles of republicanism. But like I told you, the original title of the book was not Republic. It was Politia, which means the structure of the state, the regime, but not regime in the sense of a totalitarian regime. That word has become corrupted by the great tyrants of the 20th century, like Adolf Hitler and Stalin and Mussolini and Mao. So it's hard to use the word regime in a neutral way. But if you can think about a regime in a neutral way, it just means the structure of the state. So what will be the structure of the state such that it will ensure the stability and the well-being of the people? And so there's this emphasis now on the well-being of the people, on the common good, rather than the good of some sectarian interest, some sect of the population. In fact, Plato will teach that whenever one sect, one group appropriates the power, whether it be from money or from wealth or for whatever means, that's the greatest threat to a republic. If there's something that will undermine a republic, it will be sectarian interest, the interest of some select group. But that's part of the degeneration of the republic. Now, so where did the word republic come from? Well, when the Romans conquered Greece, they also tried to appropriate their culture as best they can, because the Greeks were much more educated and advanced intellectually than the Romans were at that time. And so the Romans had this great military power, which came much later after Plato, after Alexander the Great, and then the Romans conquered Greece. But all the doctors, they learned everything were Greek. The teachers were Greek. They learned everything from the Greeks. Not everything. The Romans were sort of like the Borg, if you're a Trekkie. Whatever they conquered someone, they appropriated their culture, and they tried to. And so that's what made them so great. And so what they got from the Greeks was their great intellectual achievement and the arts and so on. So when they saw the word politia and they translated it into Latin, they translated it into res publica. They used the word res, which in Latin means thing, but they meant it as a political thing. And then publica means people. So the word republic means people thing. And it sounds awkward, I know, but we just say republic, but it's res publica. It means a people thing. And so there's an emphasis here on the people, on the well-being of the people. And if you study the history of Republican political theory, you'll always find that what will be the structure of the state such that it will secure the well-being of the people. Okay, so that's what Plato's up to in the Republic. He's developing in language and in thought the ideal city-state, so we can have something to shoot for, something to establish, an ideal, and it's not going to ever perfectly embody that ideal, but at least we have something to shoot for, an ideal. Well, let's jump now into book 6. And I'm going to give you book 6 and book 7 to read. And I'm just going to try to bring out those aspects of book 6 and 7 that highlight Plato's idea of human nature. And I'm going to call this lecture Plato on human nature, because there's so much more to Plato's doctrine and theory of human nature that I can even talk about. Books have been written on this, but I'll try to contract and I'll try to say what's most decisive, and I'll try to bring it out of those 2 chapters. But like I said at the beginning, I'll be reading into the text some things that are there implicitly in other texts of Plato. They're not my ideas, they're Plato's ideas, but I'm going to read those into it to enrich the ideas a little bit without doing violence to the text. It's tricky business, because normally if you read ideas into the text, you're distorting the text. You're putting your own ideas into the text. It's like reading somebody else's ideas, and it's like saying Joe Biden says we're going to defund the police when he says I'm not going to defund the police. You can't say somebody said something if they didn't say it, right? Or if they don't believe it. So you can't, when you're reading a philosophical text, you can't say that Plato said something if he didn't say it in the text. But you can say that if he said it somewhere else in the text and it relates to that. So anyhow, I don't mean to confuse you. I just wanted to alert you to that. All right, so by the time we get to book 6, now a lot has happened. Obviously, you haven't read book 1, 2, 3, 4, and 5. But by the time you get to book 6 of the Republic, Socrates has everyone there. Let me just tell you one thing. There's this big celebration going on in Athens, in Piraeus, at the port, which is still called that today. The main port in Athens is called Piraeus. And Socrates is there. He's at the home of this man, this old man called Cephalus, a rich old man. And Plato's brother is there too. His name is Glaucon. His other brother is there, Polymarchus. And Cephalus's son is there. I think, no, Cephalus's son is Polymarchus. And then Plato's other brother is there. But in book 6, by the time you get to book 6, the only two people that are talking are Plato and Glaucon. Now, in real life, Glaucon was, the reason I say in real life, because there's a difference between these people who really lived in Athens and then what's happening in the dialogues, right? They're related because it's based on history. It's sort of like watching a movie that's based on history, but everything in the movie is not historically perfect. So Socrates is talking with Glaucon, who is Plato's brother, who actually did become a politician, unlike Plato. And they've established the idea, or Socrates has gotten Glaucon and everyone else listening to accept the point that there will be justice in the state. Justice is an important thing because the ideal city-state is a just state. It has to be ruled by just rulers, and it has to provide for the just, the state itself has to be rooted in justice. You know, justice is one of those things that's both individual and social, because people can be just or unjust, and societies can be just or unjust. So it's one of those things that straddles both society and the individual. That straddling is going to be very important. I'll talk about that in a minute. So they reached the point where it's been established that there will be justice in the state only when the wisest people are ruling. Okay. Now, the people who take up wisdom as their vocation are the philosophers, because the very word philosophy means the lover of wisdom. Philos means love, Sophia is wisdom. So the people who are genuine philosophers, that is, who take wisdom as their ultimate concern, and the people who have excellence of character, these people need to be the rulers. There needs to be strong rulers in the Republic. Let me say this in passing, but it's more than it's an important point. Plato's Republic is not a democratic republic. You see, our founding fathers in the United States established a constitution that would be called democratic republic. So they really emphasized the rule of the people. Demos means people, and republic means people thing I told you already. So they wanted of the people, by the people, for the people. They really emphasized self-rule, that the people should be ruling the government. The people are the government. And because they were breaking from England and it was a monarchy there. But Plato didn't have much trust in democracy. The Greeks invented democracy and they tried it in Greece. He thought it's giving too much rule to the people. So it should be a republic, but it should be ruled by strong rulers and strong laws. So he created what he calls an aristocratic republic. It's still a republic, and it still belongs to the history of Republican political theory, but it's not a democratic republic, because he didn't believe in giving so much power only to the people. So they've established the fact that there will be justice in the state. There'll be no end to the problems of the state until philosophers become rulers. or politicians become philosophers. So that's one of the great ideas that he expresses in the Republic, the rule of the philosopher rulers. So then they begin to discuss, well, these philosopher rulers will have to have a particular kind of education. Now, the word for education in ancient Greek is paideia, P-A-I-D-E-I-A. And the original pronunciation was probably paideia. The D had a kind of TH sound. Like when we say water, some people don't say water, they say water. The D sometimes has a TH sound. Paideia. So what is paideia? It means education, but words are words. And what philosophers do, what Plato is doing, is trying to give an adequate idea to that word. A word refers to something. So what is that something that education refers to? Anybody can say we live in a republic, but is it a republic when only the rich people are ruling? Or anyone can say, I'm educated, but what is education? So this is the big thing. When philosophy is raising these ultimate questions, they're using the same words, but they're trying to find out what is the adequate idea that word refers to. Because words are cheap, right? So what is education? So this is also, those books 6 and 7 are also the beginnings of the philosophy of education, which has a long history that reaches all the way up to our times. Philosophy of education. What is paideia? So they're talking about the education of these philosopher rulers. So now let me try to highlight what it is about the education of the philosopher rulers that shines light on Plato's notion of human nature. Like I said earlier, these philosopher rulers are going to be the rulers of this republic. And so they must be genuine philosophers or politicians who become philosophical. So they have to be lovers of wisdom. Now, as lovers of wisdom, they undergo a particular kind of education, which Plato lays out quite carefully in the Republic. And this education is not just learning things that have been discovered and are part of the body of knowledge of the times, but it's also a moral education. These philosopher rulers have to become not only wise, but they have to be courageous. And not only courageous and wise, but they have to be temperate. And not only courageous and wise and temperate, but they have to be driven by drives that have become sublimated, that is spiritualized for wisdom. So their drive, their desires, their erotic desires need to be sublimated, spiritualized, such that what they want to procreate in is beauty. They want to procreate beauty. And this highest beauty is wisdom. So they have to be genuine philosophers, and they have to possess excellence of character. That is wisdom, courage, temperance, and most of all, there has to be a harmony in their soul. And that harmony is going to be made possible by justice. Justice is the harmony of the soul. Now, I'm going to share with you a very lofty idea that animates the whole 10 books of the Republic. And it's this, that the ideal state is the soul writ large. The human soul, writ like writing, large. What does he mean by that? What Plato means by that is, if you could have a vision of the ideal soul of a human being, now we're getting closer to human nature. The ideal human being would become the standard upon which you could base the structure of the ideal state. The ideal polis is the soul writ large, but not just any soul, a soul that has achieved human nature. And so the more wisdom and courage and justice and temperance, and the more one sublimates one's erotic drives towards procreation and beauty, the more human one becomes. So if you could have a vision of the ideal soul of a human being, one that has achieved wisdom, courage, temperance, justice, and has sublimated their erotic desire for pleasure. By sublimate, I mean spiritualize. Like romantic love is a sublimation of, or a love song is sublimation of erotic desires. Taking that energy and focusing it on procreation in beauty. If you could have a vision of that kind of human nature, all you would have to do is expand it, write it large, the soul writ large, and translate it into political terms, is what Plato does in the Republic. And you would have an articulation of the ideal state. So he's straddling two things there: the individual soul who's achieved the epitome of human nature, and the ideal state, which has achieved the epitome of justice and making possible the conditions for the well-being of the people. The ideal state is the soul writ large. It's one of those themes that runs through the whole Republic, and he articulates that in many ways. So what is the human soul for Plato? Well, the human soul is tripartite. It has three main parts. What's driving the soul, like a wild, like a strong black horse driving a chariot. What's driving it is appetites. And then there's another horse, to use a metaphor. Actually, this is Plato's own metaphor. Now I'm taking this from another dialogue called the Phaedrus, and I'm reading into the text, but I'm not reading my own ideas. It's been Plato's idea. So I'm doing something that I can do because I know Plato's philosophy. So there's another, like a horse. It's not really a horse, but you can think of this dimension of your soul, of the human soul, like a white steed. And it's called spirit. And don't think of spirit like in spiritualism or it's some ghost or something like that. The way the Greeks used the word spirit meant like when you say somebody is spirited, you know, they're full of life, animated. Anima actually is the word for soul in Latin. That's why we say something is animated. So there's spirit, like a white horse. There's appetites. What are appetites? It's your drives. It's what's pushing you forward. It's what makes animals do what they do, what makes herding dogs want to herd. It's what makes, you know, everything do what it wants to do. That's called drives, appetites. It's the desire for gratification, to get what you want, to be able to do that. So we have appetites, we have spirit, and we have intellect. These are the three main parts of a human soul. Now, appetites and spirit are something we share with the other animals, but intellect is something that delineates the human. It's what sets us apart. It's the specific difference. It's what makes the human animal different from all other animals. I just met a lady today. She says, I wonder, if dogs have a soul, are they going to be with us when we die? I said, well, in ancient Greece, everything that's living has a soul. For Plato, he spoke of the world soul, all living things, and even the inorganic world. The earth itself has a soul. Anything living has a soul. Even the earth and the plants and the animals and humans and whatever else is living anywhere has a soul, because it's the soul that gives life. Now, the human soul is different from all these other souls, of course, but everything living has a soul. So Plato spoke of the world soul, and the human soul is like a refraction of light. It's like if you took back in the 60s, we used to take crystals and put them in the window, and the sunlight would hit them, and all over your house there'd be like rainbows, because the crystal would diffract the light in such a way that it would make rainbows. So each of those refractions are like a human soul coming from the world soul, which is like the sun. Okay, so the human soul has three parts: appetites, that is drives, so what we share with the animals. We have spirit, like a white horse, and we have intellect. And then there are wings of the soul too. Now, of course, it doesn't really have wings like angel wings, but the wings of the soul are a metaphor that Plato used in another dialogue for whatever has wings can fly, right? So the wings are the erotic drives of a human being that have become sublimated. I'm deliberately using that word, which Sigmund Freud made a big deal of sublimation, but he must have gotten it from Plato, because the idea is already there in Plato. Sublimation just means you take some raw drive and spiritualize it, and it's redirected. It's a very healthy thing to do, actually, because like anger can be sublimated and it turns into competitive sports, for example, or sexuality can be sublimated. It turns into music, it turns into romance, it turns into making things. And, so sublimation is a good way to express energy without having it turn back on yourself and, repressing it and then creating all kinds of neuroses. But the idea is already in Plato. So the wings of the soul are what allow it to rise up and move beyond the physical into the metaphysical. Meta means beyond, and physical is something material. So those are the parts of a human soul, the tripartite soul of a human being: appetites, spirit, and intellect, and then the wings of the soul. Now, how is this all related to politics? Well, just like with a human being, if a human being takes their appetites, which is basically the desire for pleasure and profit and power, and they spiritualize that, what happens is they become temperate. They're not greedy. So politically speaking, then we can write that large and speak politically now. The temperance then would have to do with the business class. There has to be a class of people that deal with commerce, because no person can live alone. We live in, you couldn't even have a glass of milk unless, you had a farm, a dairy farm. So it's pretty hard to live in society without other people, with needing other people. So Plato knows that. So there has to be commerce and business and artisans and craftsmen and people producing things. Well, these people produce a class of people in the political arena, and they have to be temperate. They can't be greedy. Like bankers can't be greedy. You know, in 2008, I was in Italy teaching. I wasn't paying attention to economic things. When I came back, a third of my retirement was just gone. And I was listening to the radio once, and there was this man who was an economist. They were interviewing him about his book that he just wrote in macroeconomics. He said the whole meltdown in 2008, the recession, was based on a handful of greedy business bankers, actually. You know, so that perked up my ears. It's very important that the business class not be greedy. Okay, so temperance. If somebody's temperate, they're not going to be greedy. They're going to be generous. And they're going to be thinking about the common good. Okay, so that's how. So that excellence of character called temperance, sophrosine is the Greek word. If you write it large, then you have a business class and a class of commerce and artisans and a labor people who are producing things who are not greedy. Then what about spirit? How does spirit become excellent? The human spirit. It becomes excellent when it becomes courageous. Andrea is the Greek word. It's where we get words like Andrea, Andrew. Andrea means courage. So a courageous spirit is a spirit that has achieved excellence. Okay, it's an excellence of character. It's called arete. A-R-E-T-E means excellence of character in Greek. So these sophrosine or temperance is the excellence of character having to do with our appetites. Courage is excellence of character having to do with our spirit. Okay? So how does this relate to politics? Well, you need a class of people who keep order in the state. And you need another class of people who keep enemies out of the state. So keeping enemies out, that's the military. Keeping order within, that's the police. So the police and the military have to be courageous. If they're courageous, they're not going to be brutal. Usually, brutality comes from fear. You know, if you ever seen someone who's courageous, they're usually gentle until it's time not to be gentle, and then, but the time not to be gentle is much more it's much further down the road than people who are very afraid. Okay, so police brutality would come only with a group of police who are fearful. So if the police are courageous, there's not going to be police brutality. They're going to be thinking about keeping the peace first. And the military have to be courageous. Okay, so that's how, so this, remember I told you, the ideal person is the ideal state, the soul writ large. And then what about intellect? All humans have some reasoning powers, but these rulers need to possess wisdom. Now, wisdom is different from knowledge. Wisdom usually has to do with the whole. Knowledge has to do with knowing certain disciplines and knowing certain things. But wisdom has to do with seeing how all those things are interconnected and getting the big picture. And there's three kinds of wisdoms. There's speculative wisdom, there's practical wisdom, and there's wisdom speaking. Speculative wisdom has to do with seeing the whole story of existence, divine and human. Now that's taken from another dialogue called the Phaedrus, where Phaedrus asks Socrates, what is the subject matter of philosophy, Socrates? And he says, the subject matter of philosophy, Phaedrus, is the whole story of existence, divine and human. So I thought that's a good expression of speculative wisdom, Sophia. So these rulers have to possess Sophia. Now there's another kind of wisdom, it's called practical wisdom, phronesis in Greek, Phronesis. And that has to do with, practical wisdom has to do with making choices and choosing the course of action that's most probably going to lead to well-being for oneself and whoever one's leading. For Plato, this practical wisdom is connected to speculative wisdom because he believes, and we need to address this, that when you gain insight into these ultimate ideas, like if you could gain insight into what is courage, that you would become courageous. Insight into the ideas evokes a transformation of the person who has the insight. This is a very deep idea, actually. And some of these ideas, by the way, in philosophy, take time to digest and germinate in you. But at first, just put the pieces together and repeat, what I'm saying and what you've heard. Then later on, you want to critically evaluate what you just heard. And then later on, you want to assimilate your own critical evaluation. That's called critical thinking. But at first, just put the pieces together. So for the piece I want you to put together here is that for Plato, gaining insight into these ultimate ideas, whatever they may be, like what is courage? If you gain insight into that, then you become courageous. So this is a very lofty idea. There's some things you learn that after you learn it, you're still the same person. Like after you learn how to do a quadratic equation in mathematics, you're still the same person. It's just now you know how to do quadratic equations. But there are other insights that when you gain insight into that, you're a different person after that. I mean, by different, you're still the same person, obviously. I mean, you don't just walk out like another person. What I meant by that, you know what I mean by that, there's a radical transformation that takes place. You're seeing the world differently now. And so this is a very important insight into Plato's theory of ideas, which is his main theory. It's called the theory of forms or the theory of ideas. And then there's wisdom speaking, the third kind of wisdom, which is nothing other than these other two wisdoms, speculative wisdom and practical wisdom, and it becomes articulate. And that's called wisdom speaking. So these rulers have to possess Sophia, which is speculative wisdom, phronesis, which is practical wisdom, and alithine rhetoricae, which means true rhetoric. Now, there's other kinds of rhetorics that are not true rhetoric. There were these people in ancient Greece who were sophists, and they would just speak, they didn't believe in truth. And they believed everything is just a lie. They wanted everybody to think that there's no truth. Everybody has their own opinions. Every opinion is of equal worth. All the news is false. There's nothing, everybody just has their own opinions. And here's my opinion. And there's no truth. There's no falsity. There's no good. There's no bad. That might makes right then. If there's no true or false, no right and wrong, then might makes right. And this was a great threat for Plato. This is the greatest threat to the Republic. That is philosophical, it's called relativism. When you believe everybody has their own opinions, every opinion is of equal worth, there's no truth, there's no falsity, no right, no wrong, that might makes right. As soon as that takes over, the Republic is gone. So that's another big threat, second only to sectarian, well, they're both pretty bad, but sectarian interest is the other important undermining force to a republic. So who is this ideal ruler? It's the one who's achieved the epitome of human nature. It's an ideal, but it's something to shoot for. And these should be the rulers, should have rulers that at least approximate that. But it sheds light on human nature because now we know human nature is made up of appetites, spirit, and intellect, and we have desires. So when the appetites become excellent and achieve arte, then they become temperate. When the spirit achieves excellence and it achieves arte, it becomes courageous. When the intellect achieves arte, it achieves wisdom in its threefold way. Speculative wisdom, practical wisdom, wisdom speaking. And when our erotic drives become excellent, they become sublimated, and they desire to procreate in beauty. They want to make something that lasts beyond them, and they want to participate in eternity in that way. I'm realizing as I talk, I'm going to have to make more than one lecture on each of these thinkers. Otherwise, they're going to be very long. So I'm going to make 2 on Plato for sure, because I've given you a lot just now, and I want to concentrate. I really haven't concentrated on books 6 and 7 yet. This is all things that we can read into book 6 and 7 legitimately without doing violence to Plato's text. But I really haven't talked about the substance of book 6 and 7, and I've talked longer than I wanted to. But I don't want to race through this. I'd like you to get a glimpse, a real glimpse of Plato's world, and hopefully you'll be inspired to read more of Plato. So that's enough for now. I'm going to make one soon on book 6 and book 7 of the Republic. And this is like the place where the Republic itself reaches its apex. And then he's going to show the degeneration of that after that. We won't deal with that. I just want you to, like I said, get a glimpse of Plato's philosophy and read some primary texts by Plato himself and book 6 and 7. So we'll talk about book 6 and 7 next time. But that's a good context to read book 6 and 7. And so book 6 and 7 are about the education of these philosopher rulers, but it's also about human nature too, because it's going to be talking about the stages. This education, this paideia of the philosopher rulers is nothing other than the stages of the development of human nature towards becoming a genuinely educated person, an authentically human person, a true human being. So being human for Plato is a process. Of course, we're all born human, but becoming human is a becoming. There are stages. So Plato is going to delineate these stages. He's a developmental human philosopher of human nature. I haven't seen that too much in the secondary texts on Plato, but it's definitely there. I'm not making it up. There's a development going on. And I'd like to bring out that development and show Plato's as a philosopher of the development of human nature towards becoming truly human. So they're like different stages of becoming truly human, becoming a true human being. Okay, so that's enough for the first lecture. The next one will be on book 6 and 7. All right? All right.